Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I am doing the second part of my May wrap-up. Yes, I am behind. I am catching up now. So the first part of my May wrap-up was posted a while ago now, and in that I talked about the things I read for 2 different readathons in May. This is everything else plus 1 more readathon. At the end of May there was the Tourathon. There's going to be 2 books in here that I've already done full reviews for, and 1 that I still have yet to do my full review for. And then because they were part of the Tourathon, I'm going to also talk about 2 different short stories that I read, even though I don't usually do wrap-ups for individual short stories that I read on my booktube channel. So the first book I finished in May was one that I started reading before any of the readathons at the beginning of the month started, and this was not for either of those readathons. And this is The Hazel Wood by Melissa Albert. This is an ARC copy that I won in a Goodreads giveaway. This came out in January, and I already have a full review of this one on my channel in the double review video. I will link that video for you. Basically, this is a young adult fantasy novel that was very highly hyped. I would say sort of urban fantasy, contemporary fantasy. It starts out feeling very much like a YA contemporary with a girl who has, you know, a kind of messed up family life and family history and school situation until elements from her grandmother's creepy fairy tales start coming into play. I thought the writing in this was excellent for a YA debut, and it was fun to watch how it went from being a very mundane story into being dark, weird, twisted fairy tale fantasy. So I was pleasantly surprised by this book. I will say I think this would be a great, like, fall, October, Halloweenish read. It really did give me some of those kind of eerie vibes. So I was surprised in retrospect that this was a January release and not like a September or October release, because that's the season that I would associate the atmosphere of this book with. And that's all I think I'm going to say about this right now. If you want to hear more, please do check out my full review. Next, we get to jump over all the books that I read for those readathons and already talked about in my part 1 wrap-up, and the next thing I read was another fairy tale-ish contemporary urban fantasy YA thing, and that is The Treachery of Beautiful Things by Ruth Francis Long. I didn't like this as much as The Hazel Wood. As you can tell from the cover, this was from the era when, like, the way you could tell that something was a YA fantasy book was that there was a girl in a ball gown on the cover looking kind of vacant-eyed. 2012, that's when this book was published. So I read this because it was a group read for the Into the Forest group on Goodreads, which I will link down below. I read a library copy of this book and I have already returned it. And I am going to tell you, the first half of this book for me was a total slog, and I almost DNF'd it, but I ended up being glad that I didn't, because at the halfway point or a little after, things really turned around for me and I started enjoying it a lot. So this is about a girl named Jenny, and some years ago her brother was like stolen away by the magical forest, and she saw it happen, but no one believes her, and over the years she's come to believe that she was seeing things, that wasn't actually what happened, that, you know, she's traumatized and whatever. Except on the anniversary of the date when it happened, she goes to the place where it happened, and lo and behold, she herself gets lost in the magic wood that's basically fairy. I don't know if it was called fairy in the book or not, but basically she goes wandering off into the woods of fairy, and she decides that she's gonna have to try to rescue her brother from the fairy queen and bring him back. And the first half of this book is just so utterly predictable, and we have no reason whatsoever to care about Jenny as a character. We have a whole lot of, oh my god, after all these years it turns out the magic was real. And then fairy is really dangerous and she ends up in a lot of peril, and there's this, you know, very handsome, mysterious, definitely not human, but what is he guy named Jack with, you know, very intriguing eyes. What is Jack and what are his motives? We don't know, but his eyes are very sultry. So I ended up being really surprised, pleasantly surprised, when Jack turned out to be by far the more interesting character of the 2. Around that midpoint where things started to turn around for me, we started actually seeing more of the story from Jack's perspective, and he's a much more interesting character than Jenny, and he's got much more, like, folklore stuff, layers of it going on with what he is and what's going on with him. Ruth Frances Long is really trying to cram like extremely ambitious amounts of folklore, fairy tale, myth, all of that into this one story. And sometimes it's a little convoluted, but when it gets to be that much folklore, fairy tale, myth stuff, I find it a lot of fun. There are older pantheons of gods and newer legends, along with a lot of different interpretations of different, you know, folklore tropes and creatures and stuff. There's an element of this story that's very Tam Lin-ish. There's a bit in the middle that's like kind of a mini Snow White retelling. And so come the second half of the book, I was kind of into it, and I was glad that I did not DNF. That first half was just rough for me though, so I can't give this more than 3 stars. I would say 2 stars for the first half, 4 stars for the second half, even it out to 3. Next we have The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty, which was also a group read for the Into the Forest group, and in addition to that it was a group read for the Booktube SFF Award read-alongs. So you've already heard a little bit of my take on this in the video where I talked about all of the Booktube SFF Award nominees that I had read and what I thought of them. I'll link that video for you, but you haven't gotten my full wrap-up on this yet. So basically, I think I was hoping for something kind of different from this book than what it delivered. It was much more of a sort of formulaic, almost epic fantasy feeling thing than I was hoping for. I was hoping, since this starts out at least in 17th century Cairo, that it would have a lot more of a historical fantasy feel than it did. The sort of comparison point in my mind for historical fantasy right now is like The Bear and the Nightingale, where the history is really, really woven throughout every aspect of that story. And that's not what this does. This is more the sort of story where the protagonist, you know, starts off living a normal life in the normal world and then gets whisked off into the magical world, where there's all the magical world intrigue and people and stuff that we learn has coexisted with the human world forever, but it's got its own stuff going on. And all of that just felt like really generic fantasy fare for me. Despite the fact that it's in a Middle Eastern setting and based on some Middle Eastern folklore, I felt like all of those fantasy elements were really slotted into really standard fantasy tropes. So there are actually 2 point of view characters in here. The first is Nari, who's a con woman scraping by. She has some magical abilities, specifically healing abilities, but she doesn't think that they actually do her any good. They don't, you know, put food on the table. What she relies on to get by is straight up trickery. She accidentally summons an ancient magical warrior who she would think of as a djinn, but he insists that that's not the right term for what he is. He's something called a deva, and the distinction between the two has a lot to do with the history of the magical world and the magical inhabitants, who are basically djinn or deva depending on cultural distinctions and political history. And all of the details of that, like, I am forgetting all of it already. But the point is that the Deva slash Jinn, which are the pervasive magical people in this world, are basically the stand-ins for the, you know, immortal, powerful people with magic in just about any traditional Western fantasy world. And Dara, this particular guy, is the stand-in for, like, the very sexy, immortal magic dude who's kind of like a love interest. That you just see a lot, and it was nothing new for me. Anyways, Dara finds out about Nari's magical powers and thinks it means that she's the descendant of an otherwise extinct magical line, and that her powers are very important, and he needs to get her to Davabad, the magical city of brass. And so in this storyline, the first maybe half of the book is just like getting Nari to Davabad and all of the peril that they encounter on the journey. The other point of view perspective is sort of equally tropey. This character is a young, idealistic prince in Davabad who is learning how oppressively bad conditions are for people in his city. The Shafit are sort of the underclass of people with mixed human blood. And this storyline is basically just Ali learning more about the nefarious intrigue and social injustice in his city and wondering, you know, what he can do about it. This is also like just really generic and nothing I haven't seen before. By the time the two storylines come together, we're on to like, you know, a whole bunch of tropes. There's Nari struggling with trying to learn magic. And by the way, the fact that she has healing magic means that she's like one of these fantasy characters who gets gravely injured and then magically heals and is up and going again, which is just, you know, I take it in a few books sometimes, and then after a while you read it in enough books and it just feels like lazy storytelling. Basically, the focus of the second half of the book and what seems to be the point of the series going forward is all of the political intrigue and how everyone is a pawn and no one knows what's actually going on. I think I've seen some people describe what's going on with Nari and both Dara and Ali as being like a really tropey standard issue love triangle. I didn't actually read it that way. I'm tempted to believe characters when they say that a friendship is platonic, as is the case with Nari and Ali. I didn't see him as a potential second love interest for her. I tend to make that assumption, and then many books tend to prove me wrong. So we'll see going forward. I could be wrong. Anyhow, overall, this was just much more of a traditional fantasy with a lot of predictable traditional elements than I was hoping for. It's not that I don't like traditional fantasy. There's actually plenty of really traditional fantasy that uses all of these tropes that I enjoy a lot, that I am happy to read. I don't know if it's because that wasn't the set of expectations that I came into this with that made this not click for me like that. I will acknowledge that there's obviously a whole lot of value in showing this sort of really traditional fantasy story, but in a Middle Eastern setting with, you know, Islamic characters and history and stuff, because, you know, people of different cultural, religious, ethnic backgrounds deserve to see themselves represented in these really pervasive types of fantasy stories. But for me, like, making some comparisons, you know, the journey to the magical city part of this book sort of reminded me of, say, Strange the Dreamer, but without all of the, you know, gorgeous lyrical writing and atmosphere and creative storytelling that Laini Taylor can pull off. And I've definitely read lots of authors that can make me care more about convoluted political intrigue. So I gave this 3 stars because I enjoyed it while I was reading it. I was turning the pages, you know, I was enjoying the twists and turns and the tension and all of that. But the longer it's been since I've read it, the less and less I feel like I'm going to be compelled to pick up the sequel when it comes out, unless, of course, the sequel is also nominated for things and there are read-alongs I'm participating in and such. I wouldn't object to reading it, but I don't think I'm going to be lining up to pick up the second book in this series on my own accord. Next we have on this list, I was talking about how there's a good deal of really traditional and epic fantasy that I do end up really enjoying, and this is one of them. This is The Queens of Innis Lear by Tessa Gratton. This is one that I need to do a full review on, so I'm going to be brief here because I know I'll be doing a full review later. This is a King Lear retelling. I feel like if there hasn't been an epic fantasy King Lear retelling before now, like, why? Because in retrospect it is so obvious. By the way, standalone epic fantasy is my type of epic fantasy. I appreciate a good standalone epic fantasy. I will talk more about this in my full review, but I think this is probably the best Shakespeare retelling I can ever remember reading. I tend to roll my eyes at the ways a lot of authors deal with Shakespearean sources in what I feel is like a really superficial way. This really digs deep and like pulls apart a lot of the play, and it's faithful in some ways and unfaithful in others, and it feels like there are reasons behind all of those choices. What this really does is focuses the play away from Lear himself and puts that focus not only on the three daughters but on some other characters as well, including some who aren't in the original story. There's a lot of focus on the family history here, with the mother of the three daughters, who is not mentioned in the play at all. And then there's also a lot of focus on the character who is based on Edmund in the play, who is the villain of a subplot in the original. In this book, his name is Ban, and he's a major sort of really compelling anti-hero type character in a way that also makes a lot of sense. So I'm really looking forward to pulling this apart a bit more for a review, and that's just going to take a lot of brain power that I haven't had time to give it yet. But this is slow-paced, it is chunky. It took me a while to read. I read it pretty slowly and in a leisurely manner as I was reading other things. But it's a slow build. Some of the writing is lovely. It's properly grand and sweeping with, you know, all of the big political history and magic in the land and stuff. Prophecies, the language of the trees, invading armies. And I will be honest with you, King Lear is not a play that I've given that much thought to in my life. It is not one of my favorite Shakespeares by a long shot. And so I'm kind of pleased to just let this be my new headcanon version of King Lear. I gave this 4 stars. I will do a full review, and this will probably be a standalone review as opposed to a double review, because I think I've got a lot of stuff I'm gonna want to say about this. Now we're going on to the Tourathon, which was hosted by Libby Stevenson. I'll link her channel down below. This was a very informal readathon over Memorial Day weekend to just read a lot of Tor.com publishing releases. The dates were sort of flexible. I basically used the long weekend for it, and then I'm just going to count everything that I started during that weekend, regardless of when I finished it, because some of these I finished a little after the weekend ended, a little bit into the week. But I said in my intro that there were 2 books in this wrap-up that I had already done full reviews on. I was wrong. There were 3, because the first thing I read was Artificial Condition by Martha Wells, which I had in NetGalley Archive. I've done a full review where I paired this with the second thing that I read in the week, which was The Only Harmless Great Thing by Brooke, Bolander. So I'm going to very briefly touch on each of these and then send you to the double review. Artificial Condition is the second book in the Murderbot Diaries series, following the grumpy security unit that calls itself Murderbot. Murderbot is off on another adventure, and Murderbot is a very likable protagonist. I gave this 4 stars, which is the same rating that I gave the first book. And The Only Harmless Great Thing is a novelette in terms of word count, and this is a standalone, and it's a very unusual alt history story involving elephants and Coney Island and radium girls. In this alt history, Topsy the elephant is sold to US Radium after the radium girls all get sick with radiation poisoning. And so the elephants have to take over from them painting the watch faces. But there's also a through line that's in the present day or a near future with a scientist who's working on a project regarding the elephants that has, you know, some serious ethical implications. And then there's also a through line with elephant memory and mythology and stuff. Very interesting. I gave this 5 stars. It's really unlike anything I think I've ever read before. It's the sort of thing that takes close reading to understand what it is you're reading and how it all fits together. I think I went back and read like the beginning of the book several times as I was going through it, so even though it's short, don't expect that you're gonna fly through this if you want to understand it, but I thought it was really worth the time that I put in. And then the last of the novellas was Binti the Night Masquerade by Nnedi Okorafor, which is the 3rd and final book in the Binti trilogy. So this is one that I haven't reviewed elsewhere, and I'm not going to. I think this is going to be the only time I'm going to talk about it, but there's only so much you can really say about the 3rd book in a trilogy without spoilers. I will say the first book in this series I enjoyed, but I wasn't blown away by. It felt like a bit more of a formulaic, you know, girl goes off on space adventure, thing goes terribly wrong, girl saves the day. It felt very standard to me in terms of how that story was laid out, even if the world and the characters were really interesting and kind of different. The second book sort of broke all of those molds and really blew me away. There were things that I found really profoundly moving about it. And then this is a direct continuation of what happens in the second book. Book 2 ends on a major cliffhanger. And I will say that I really appreciated how this brought together sort of the story of what's happening with Binti and this sort of space alien war conflict that she encountered in the first book, but in a way that's more complicated than the first book, and there aren't easy answers and things go wrong. This whole story is sort of revolving around this idea that Binti is a master harmonizer of her people, the Himba, and that as such, she is trying to be a peacemaker. And there's a point around the middle of this book that feels like it would be the climax of that storyline, and it doesn't go the way it would if this story were really formulaic and simple. I think of all 3 books in this series, this is the one that goes the darkest, and yet it ended up leaving me remarkably hopeful given the things that aren't resolved in this book, the things that it turns out maybe aren't Binti's job to resolve. This whole series has focused on Binti's sort of fractured identity of being from this really traditionalist, really insular culture, and having betrayed that culture and her family to go to Space University at Uni. And in the second book, she felt like she needed to go back home. But when she got there, it was obvious in a lot of ways that she wasn't going to fit in anymore, even though her Himba identity was the thing that got her through the trials of the first book. There is a progression in this series where, as it goes on, Binti becomes more and more and more different things that all have to become part of what she accepts as her ever-growing identity of who she is and what she can be. And ultimately, I found the way this series and this book ended to be really hopeful. I think there is a lot in terms of what is symbolized by University in this story, and that sort of hope for a great place of intergalactic learning where all of these alien species can come together with a peaceful mission. I've been sort of saying recently that I really wanted hopeful visions of the future in science fiction, and that's what Uni is in this series. And that's ultimately where I felt like the takeaway from this third volume was, and how I sort of felt that it ended on a really, really good note, even though it went very, very dark on the way. Anyways, that's a kind of garbled way to talk about a third book in a series that I thought was excellent, but I did think this was excellent, and I gave this 5 stars. And that is the end of the books. There are 2 short stories that I read as part of the Torathon. You may remember that I had like 4 that I wanted to read, and the ones that I ended up reading were just the 2 shortest ones that were part of series I was already reading, so I failed here. But the first is from the editorial pages of the Falchester Weekly Review, a Lady Trent story, which is, I think, listed as 3.5 in the reading order of Lady Trent series, and that is exactly where I read it. And this is very short and very entertaining. It's not going to make much sense if you aren't reading the Lady Trent series, I don't think. But this is told in alternating letters to the editor from Isabella, the protagonist of that series, and this guy who has claimed that he has found a cockatrice. Isabella eventually sort of lays out her reasoning for believing that this guy is perpetrating a hoax, and the guy is eventually revealing more and more of his blatant sexism of why she can't possibly know anything, this dang woman. And then at the end you eventually learn what went down with the cockatrice, or the supposed cockatrice. It's just a bit of entertaining fluff in the Lady Trent series, and if you're reading that series, you will probably get a kick out of that story. The next is The Girl Who Ruled Fairyland for a Little While by Catherynne and Valente, which is a prequel story to the Fairyland series, and this is about Mallow. I think you'll probably appreciate this more if you've read the first book. I don't imagine you need to read more than the first book, and because this is a prequel, you could theoretically read it first. It's basically about how Mallow comes to rule Fairyland, and you learn a little more about the history of some of the winds in this as well. What can I say? It's full of whimsy and wit and, you know, gorgeous, gorgeous writing, and I enjoyed it a lot, and it's all wrapped up with, you know, some good old devious Fairyland politics. So that is all. I'm finally done. I've been putting up this wrap-up because I knew it would take a long time to film, and it has taken a long time to film. But now I get to go eat some food. Maybe I have to go grocery shopping so that I have some food to eat. That might be a thing. Anyhow, these were most of the books I talked about, plus a couple more that I don't have in physical form. Let me know if you've read any of these. Let me know what you think. Watch out for a future review of the Queens of Innis Lear that is still forthcoming. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.